I'm Vicki Hogarth, and welcome to Southwest Magazine. On today's episode, we're starting what will be an ongoing conversation about systemic racism in New Brunswick. My guests today are lawyer Neil Clements and Dr. Tim Christie, Regional Director of Ethics at Horizon Health. Thank you both for being here.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Can we start off just by talking about, for people that don't understand, what is systemic racism in your own words?
From my experience, systemic racism is disproportionately black and brown folks do not have similar access to opportunities, be it financial, employment, equal access to the criminal justice system. That, for me, at least in my experience, that's been the systemic racism that I've experienced, but it's also a subtle experience, and it can be expressed in language within employment settings, opportunity settings, in the education system. An example of systemic discrimination, at least in my opinion, in the education system would be not actually having a program that will educate my kids about their history or a native kid's history. That would be a really easy example of a system of discrimination in education.
Dr. Christie, what is it in your words?
Well, I think, as Neil was saying, it's kind of the way structures are set up. So it doesn't have to, if we look at racism and what people are familiar with, so it would be, blatant street level things where people are calling you names or they're not giving you access to something. It's a blatant thing, and you can say that's just clearly racist. And that's somewhat easy for people to understand. But if we look at the way that our society is structured and structures in the system, that's where I would say that systemic racism comes through in ways that's not intentional. It might not be intentional. It might be, we didn't even think about it. I remember I was chairing a committee one time, and for a particular medical school, and it was like the school was 150 years old. And we had an Aboriginal applicant who got into the program, but it might have been one of the first ones getting in. So I remember saying to our committee, what is it that we have so few applicants applying to our program? The system's set up in a way that they're discriminated against at the beginning. So it's not anyone at the university, it's not anyone on our committee, it's that the criteria we use to get into these privileged positions are kind of blocked to people because of their social circumstances, their structures. So I would say, it's the way the systems are set up. So if I give you an example, right now in New Brunswick, if I go hunting or fishing illegally, I can be arrested for that, and I could actually be put in jail for that. I could be fined, I could have my car seized. In New Brunswick, if I racially discriminate against someone, that doesn't happen to me. I won't get arrested. I won't get fined, I won't get put in jail, I won't have anything seized. So the structure of the way that we even address racism in New Brunswick is set up to be ineffective, it's set up not to work. And I have tons of thoughts on that. So if we look at, say, the New Brunswick Human Rights Act, this is the only way in New Brunswick that if I say I'm the victim of racial discrimination, it's the only way that I have a legal remedy. Now, to do that, as the victim of racial discrimination, I would have to file a complaint with the Human Rights Commission. So if I'm the victim, say someone punches me in the nose, do I have to file a written complaint to anyone? I explained to the police that I was assaulted, and they conduct an investigation. So now, if I say I've suffered racial discrimination, the first thing I have to do is write a formal complaint to the Human Rights Commission. Not only do I have to give them a complaint, I have to convince them that this has happened. So now the burden of proof is on the victim to actually convince someone that racial discrimination has happened.
Notwithstanding, it's a regulatory offense under the Provincial Offences Procedures Act,
right.
And normally a regulatory offense does not put the burden on Mr. Christie in that particular context.
Right.
Usually, if the offense is created, the action has taken place, then the person who has breached that provincial offense has to prove that they didn't. At least that's my experience from a health and safety perspective when it comes to regulatory compliance. So for Tim to have to prove, or anyone to have to prove that they've been racially discriminated against is a reverse burden. It makes no sense.
Exactly. So that would be an example of how our system is set up to actually disadvantage people from the beginning. So when you look at it on its face, who could disagree with the Human Rights Act? But when you look at the nitty-gritty of it, you say this is inherently discriminatory.
What would be the first step forward in dealing with racial discrimination and giving people more rights?
Yeah, well, in my opinion, I think, ultimately, racial discrimination should be a crime in the Criminal Code of Canada. And I know all of the provinces and municipalities are going to say, not our problem. We can't change the criminal code. But there are things that municipalities can do, there are things that the province can do to make it so, even if it's not in the criminal code, it's a punishable offense. And what they have to do is take the burden off the victim, because if I've been victimized of, say, a victim of racial discrimination, the police should actually pursue that. The police should go and arrest the person, they should interrogate the person, they should conduct an investigation. If it's proven, if there's merit to the case, they should talk to the Crown, and the Crown should prosecute the person. And if the person's found guilty, they should be punished accordingly. That's how other crimes work. So the challenging question is, why is racial discrimination set out? Why is it taken out of the normal crime thing and set out? And if you look at the history of blacks, when it was illegal for us to sit on a bus or to go to a movie theater, it was illegal. They'll arrest you for doing that stuff.
Absolutely.
Right? But now, when they're trying to say discriminating against us is illegal, they're saying, well, not really illegal. Let's put it in a Human Rights Act. Let's put it in a nice bow. Let's make it look really, really nice and appealing. Let's, surround it with platitudes so no one can disagree with us. But at the end of the day, it is really, I would say, an inherently discriminatory document. And we have them across the country.
And offenses under the Human Rights Act or the Code in New Brunswick are captured as a Schedule F offense in the Provincial Offences Procedures Act. So why can't I bring that charge? Why can't I say, hey, this has happened to me without going through the convoluted process, and I express my respect for the Human Rights Commission of New Brunswick, but there is already an offense available to me to have prosecuted in the Provincial Court of Canada related to specific sections of the Human Rights Code. So why can't I just go there? And why do I have to have a gatekeeper that is the Attorney General when deciding whether or not that's going to move forward? And why is it that I can be a disgusting racist and only be fined or sentenced to 90 days in jail if in fact that type of a case moves forward, which we have never seen to my understanding, not having any background for that statement. But I think I would have known about one of these cases moving forward. The legislation's available, the code's available. If at all, it would take simple amendments to ensure that it actually is enforced. I think Tim's hitting it on the head when it comes to systemic or systematic discrimination. That whole system, although on its face available to us, isn't really, in my opinion only, and it costs you nothing for that opinion, right? So
you said something really powerful, Neil, at the Black and Indigenous Lives rally in St. Stephen. It was, it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a policy to change a system.
That's right. And I think no policy changes without lobby, right? And my whole point of that statement was the fact that the lobby was standing around, and there were particular individuals from the political structure who were at that event, and I was allowing them to understand this is your lobby. And it will take all of those voices that you observed in St. John that day. I mean, Tim and I are here talking about our opinions. We're not attached to any one group. We're just here saying it's time for a change, and here are some opportunities for change. But I'm still relying on my friends, and I don't mean that specifically Tim, my friend. I'm still relying on you, Vicky. I'm relying on your technicians who are here to support this particular action today, to have open minds and go forth and educate your friends. Because it's not my job to convince you not to be racist, or it's not my job to convince those who are maneuvering and manipulating the system to change themselves, right? The world has already decided as a society, okay, this is wrong. It's pretty obvious, the lights are on, everybody can see. So now that you see, those who are in a position to manipulate the system, and I mean run it, well, now it's their obligation to make the change. I can't make the change. I didn't create the word racism, right? A really intelligent white scientist did. I forget the guy's name, quite frankly, but I didn't invent that word. That word was created specifically to separate groups, to create power dynamics in which one system is in play. Right, and I could get into that with you about the Irish and the blacks and the haves and the have-nots, but at the end of the day, it became an economic split, and the people of power and whoever they are decided if these two groups get together based on their economic situation, we're in trouble. My thoughts on the whole idea of race is that it's really a false narrative created to empower this system that we are trying to work within. And from that, we get this whole idea of, again, race. Separating the groups not only by color, but basing it on financial opportunity, and then suggesting, well, they're working for free, don't blame us. You need to be with us, and point back to them saying, well, they worked for free. And I know this is like a historical kind of argument, which is old, but that mentality is what pervades now. It's just very subtle, and it's built into a system. Here's a legal example. St. John's official charter did not allow blacks to sell wares in the city or fish in the harbor, okay, unless they were sponsored by a well-to-do white person. And that's not the exact quote, but that's an example of a system that's put in place hundreds of years ago. And although that's not the official charter now, that system, that ideal is still in place, but we're just not saying it. Okay? That's how I really feel about the whole idea of race and what it's used for, because there's only one race, right? I mean, really. And anybody that doesn't agree with that, I think is a challenge, right?
Why do you both think that the Black Lives Matter movement has become powerful at this point in our history? Was it about this moment that's making the whole world pay attention?
It's a remarkable thing, first of all. I think there's probably a bunch of explanations, but obviously in a global pandemic, people have different focus on things. I think it's helped us shape our public perspective on what's truly important. I think the things we've seen, so some of the killings and things are just egregious, and you can disseminate it so much more broadly now. And if you remember the Rodney King incident, what was so remarkable about that? We had videotape, we had footage.
Exactly.
Now we have videos, we have footage, we have time and time and time again, and I think, quite frankly, people are fed up with it. So what I love about the Black Lives Matter movement is that we have an opportunity to do things now. And I'm not really that big on just trying to describe racism or talking about it. And I know there are lots of groups out there, their mandate is to try to educate people, because they say, if we can educate people enough about racism, then we can change their mind, we can change their perspective, they can see how fundamentally irrational it is, and I agree with them. But I think we also have to do stuff. So if we look at, once again, say the idea of making racial discrimination a crime, one of the beauties of that, in addition to helping the victim of the crime, is what it does to the perpetrator. So in the US, the executive order they just signed now about policing, one of the phenomena they had is, if this officer is constantly racially discriminating against people and constantly caught and constantly receiving an administrative sanction, they might transfer him or her to another place. If that was a crime, that officer would now have a criminal record. You can't work as a police officer with a criminal record. If it was a crime, that professor would now have a criminal record. You can't work there. If it was a crime, that politician or that government official or that person working in the bureaucracy would have a criminal record and can't work there. So this would be a way of saying, we can educate you, but you can't occupy that position of power in society. And I think this is what I would really hope the Black Lives Matter movement proceeds towards is, in addition to trying to educate, in addition to trying to talk about our experiences, in addition to articulating the injustice, actually do something and get these people out of positions of power in our society. And like I said, if it is a crime, that has to be investigated by the police. Can you imagine the university professor who does something that discriminates against someone, and the police come arrest that person, take them, interrogate them, right? Investigate them, charge
Just like
them.
any other crime.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what would happen with other crimes, and this is where I think we have to get real about racial discrimination.
Dr.
Right.
Christie, you've been a police commissioner in the past. Can you explain the idea of defund the police? That's become also a worldwide movement. I think that a lot of people are confused about what it means.
Yeah, well, I think what they're saying is, there's a lot of things that the police do that you don't need to be a police officer to do. So someone directing traffic, you don't need a gun to do that. Someone giving out a ticket here or there, you don't need to really have a gun to do that. Doing wellness checks, you don't need to be a police officer with a gun to do that. So I think they're saying that the police budgets have kind of inflated themselves. They're heavily unionized organizations, and it's really hard to take money out of them. So all the money's, and money usually goes into salaries and that type of thing. So they're saying if we take some of that out, we could put it in, say, a social service. So if we're doing wellness checks, we could have trained healthcare professionals go do that as opposed to an armed police officer. If we need someone to keep order in a public place, we could have trained professionals do that as opposed to armed police officers. So I think the idea of defund the police is trying to say, is there a better way to allocate those resources? It's a concrete thing that you could actually do. I'm not opposed to the idea myself. But once again, I think there should be things like maybe disarm the police. I think that they've shown, and I'm not talking about any particular police force in general, but I think policing has shown over the years that it can't be trusted with the power it has in society. So if we look at the example in Nova Scotia where the police were able to do spot checks of people on the street, and they were stopping non-Caucasians 3 times more than Caucasians, I would say that's a crime. That's racial profiling. That's a form of racial discrimination. You should be charged for that. And if you're charged for that, you can no longer be a police officer and do that. So I think, once again, defund the police is a wonderful slogan. It's kind of a platitude in a sense, but I do think there's some merit to it. But like I said, I want to get the races out of these positions of power.
What do you make of the notion that people need to be anti-racist, not just not racist now? What does that mean to you?
The notion of people being anti-racist, I think that creates, just my personal opinion, to me to tell someone you now must be anti-racist is almost like now you must not have an opinion. I'm not here to stop ignorant people from being ignorant, right? That's not my job. My job is, I'm not a vaccine for racism, right? But my job is to express and ensure others can identify the problems. And then, as Dr. Christie said, those folks who are in power, who also, again, are able to identify these issues and not want to take action, well, they just need to find another opportunity for themselves. And in situations where they can be replaced by folks who openly comment positively when it comes to issues of race. And again, I don't believe in the word race. Okay, I really don't.
So, and if I can jump in, Neil, I think I would probably change the discourse at 2 levels. So at a personal level, no individual in the world has to be anti-racist if they don't want to. But I would say people in positions of power, so our elected officials, every single one of them should be anti-racist. Not just silent on it, not just not watching their language, but they should actively be working to systematically dismantle systemic racism. So I would say our politicians, our mayors, our premiers, the prime minister, all of these people have an ethical and moral obligation to be anti-racist. Individuals in their home, in their kitchen and things, you live your life the way you want to.
That's right.
But every police officer, every university professor, every doctor, every person working in the public sector that are in these positions of power Absolutely, have to be anti-racist.
And I'm not one for standardized testing, but I've seen some actual testing that's available, in a questionnaire format that pulls out hidden opinions of others. I've seen this in a documentary recently, but the questioning allows the questioner to determine based on their responses, based on the time of their responses, how long it takes them to answer, and the actual language they use, whether or not they have a racist beliefs. And I watched that. It was I think it might have been a 60 Minutes documentary, and they actually had gone to Fredericton, and there was a traveling group, right? And they were doing this test, anyways, to see which areas were most racist. And then at the end of the show, they had discussed this questionnaire, this app that was being used to determine racist beliefs. It was really quite good, and I forget the information exactly what it was, but those are available. And if I've ever believed in standardized testing, which I never have, that particular episode helped me to understand that was useful, right? That would be very useful, and I would be all for something like that. Otherwise, I don't know how we would determine who's racist, because in this particular environment, I mean, I grew up in St. John, it's the most subtle form of racism you'll ever experience, because there's, notwithstanding in January, the kids who drove by me screaming on King Street in St. John, pardon my language, public, but it happened. Despite that, I mean, I don't go around, with a thermometer testing racism. It's just not possible, especially in an environment like St. John, right? It's very subtle, but when it happens, I know it. I don't expect you to.
And I think, once again, if we go back to the public figures, it's not good enough for a public official to say, I'm not racist. They should be telling us what are they doing to be actively anti-racist.
Yes. Yeah, I agree.
I have no more patience for any of this systemic stuff. We know it's there. We've identified it. There are things we can do. So we should really start doing them. And it's going to take effort on everyone's part. But I'm not going to let these guys off the hook.
Neil, you made an announcement this week. Do you
I
want to
did.
tell everyone at home what it was?
Did. Well,
How you
let
plan
me
to
give you
get involved?
let me give you the background, a little Cole's notes. So I've been talking for my the last decade about running for council in St. John, and I got to tell you, having been involved in politics in my past, it can be a very unfriendly environment. Having spent time in both parties, neither of which I'm associated with right now, that's for sure. But I found it was always very unfriendly environment, so I just pushed it aside. But most recently, again, I understand momentum, and I'm quite frankly taking advantage of this momentum in this environment of change that St. John is experiencing, to change the demography of that council. So most recently, I'd had a chance to read a Global News article and see some video about a comment one of the councillors made. I didn't think it was appropriate. I thought, okay, I had enough. So the other day, I announced on social media that I was running as a councillor at large candidate, which again for me is, I grew up in all parts of the city, and I attended schools in all parts of the city because of my history. And to me, councillor at large just made sense, gave me an opportunity to reach more people, and more people to reach me for that matter. And it's time for a change, and I'm really hoping that I'm not the only fresh new candidate. I'm hoping that it's not unlike a decade or so ago when the whole council changed. We may not need a change of the entire council, but there are so many positive justice candidates available, and I'm hoping that they also step up to the plate, because it's an opportunity for us to work together versus against each other, as most candidates do in elections, right? This is a different environment, and I'm definitely not going to run the same campaign that you've seen for 50 years. I'm not zigging, I'm zagging. And you can take that any way you want, public. But the bottom line is, I'm not going to run a typical campaign. And a lot of people, and I thank you all for reaching out, have offered me help in specific roles. I can do this for you, I can do that for you, and I'm going to take them up on it. But you're not going to see Neil Clements signs. You're not going to see Neil Clements posters. You're going to hear Neil Clements words, and you'll be able to see my actions on a go-forward basis. Again, out of the hundreds and hundreds of positive positive communications that I had after I announced that, I only had one person say anything negative. And what I said was in my announcement, I know politics, I know it's going to be not friendly. I really wish I didn't have that expectation, but I'm black and I've had blacklash in my life, and one of my best friends said, "That's it, that's perfect, hashtag blacklash 2021." I expect it.
Yeah.
I see you, and I know who it is, and I'm okay with that.
We are almost at the end of what I hope is just the start of an ongoing conversation we can have on systemic racism. What are your final thoughts for today for people at home, and how to get involved in changing the system?
Well, on Monday night, I'm going to be presenting to St. John Common Council. I'm going to be giving a specific proposal that the municipality use every legal means available to them to make racial discrimination illegal in St. John. However they do it, make a new bylaw, whatever. I'm going to make the same proposal for the province and for the federal government. And we're going to make a motion to council that they petition every city council in the province to do the same thing.
We need a lobby, right? I need your voice to back up Dr. Christie's and the other speakers, I'm sure, who will be there. That's the key. I've throughout my entire life, I've known that there was no strength without a lobby. And there's been no lobby in this region for this change. And having worked in the government and assisted with the drafting of legislation in my career, I know the language. The language is there an appetite for change? I do not see anything but appetite for change. I actually see that the food's on the table, all you have to do is decide to eat.
Yeah.
Government.
And I'm not going to be as polite as Neil. I would say with the politicians, I'd like them to know I'm going to ram it down their throat.
There are specific civic addresses where there are bad people, and we could probably have discussions with them for change. Is that good?
Very good.
Perfect. Well, I look forward to you joining me again.
Absolutely.
Thank you both.
My pleasure.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO-TV, New Brunswick's only source for independent community television.